Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad to have you here to join us today. My name is Adrianne Arnold. I'm the business manager at AEL Environment. We're pleased to recognize tomorrow is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So we wanted to open today by acknowledging that the land we are on is a traditional home of the Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We are so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and we are privileged to work in a field that allows us to help restore the damage that's been done to this land. Now for some housekeeping. Today, we'll dive into a 45-minute presentation about managing the risks within Ontario environmental regulations. Our session will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer period. Our esteemed presenters today are Paul Wilson and Mark Givelas. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please contribute to our chat bar. We'll be monitoring it throughout the presentation, and we'll be addressing all of the questions at the end. So whenever something pops into your mind, please feel free to share it there. And finally, once the webinar is finished, you'll be asked to complete a short feedback survey. This survey helps us continue to identify areas for upcoming webinars and improve the quality of our sessions. And we are happy to share this video on request if you would like. And now I will pass it off.
Great, thanks Adrianne, and welcome to everyone. So in terms of some background, AEL Environment is a consulting engineering firm that deals specifically with the area of environmental site assessments, site remediation, records of site condition, and the kind of consulting work that goes around that, with a particular flavor of providing practical solutions that help you invest in property or manage property that you already own. And so our focus is always on bringing innovation within a framework of regulation and within a framework of rules, but also recognizing that that there are ways to accomplish different goals within those rules. And so our attempt is always to bring innovation there, and hopefully we'll get some of that flavor here today. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of what is that regulation that that we work within? Next slide. Most of our work is governed by, go back up, no, that's a good one. Thanks, Mark. Most of the work is within the framework of Reg 15304. Reg 15304 is a regulation that was promulgated in 2004, and it comes from the Environmental Protection Act. It's since been updated quite significantly in 2011, and again, I think it was tweaked in 2014. But it's something that is constantly being updated with different perspectives, and is really the placeholder for all of the conversations around environmental site assessments and the work within that framework. It's, of course, the responsibility for that falls within the Minister of the Environment or Parks and Recreation or Conservation. And it outlines a prescribed standard for doing environmental site assessments and then turning those in when required into records of site condition, which is a particular vehicle whereby the Minister of the Environment provides a level of certification with respect to the fact that you met these standards. We can go to the next slide. So just a general comment about how ESAs work and what they're there for. Environmental site assessments, as mentioned before, are a standardized way of reporting on environmental conditions. They follow a prescribed they follow a prescribed process that starts with a phase one. So the focus of the phase one is to see if there is the potential for any environmental risks that may affect value or issues with respect to the property and with respect to contamination. And if they identify any of these potential risks, then those are defined through a phase 2 environmental site assessment, which takes soil and groundwater samples and provides physical evidence with respect to whether there is an issue or not. And then the last part is if the phase 2 shows that the site is in non-compliance, then what are the options with respect to dealing with that and bringing the property back into compliance? And those usually fall into the categories of risk assessment and remediation, either individually or in concert with each other. We can go to the next slide. Often there's a conversation that we have that deals with what the standards are. We talked about kind of the upper level or preferred standard that we see gaining more and more acceptance is this OREG 15304 or the RSC regulation. But that has some very specific requirements that often can't be accommodated within a property transaction or financing or things like that. So we often rely on a slightly different standard that's developed by the Canadian Standards Association, and a CSA standard is usually used where timing doesn't allow for something longer, or the additional detail under a Reg 153 audit is not required. So this table gives you an idea of what the relative benefits are, and in some cases where one might be required or one might be more appropriate. But generally it falls into if you're doing a refinancing or you're doing a time-driven purchase or sale agreement, then you'll fall into the category of a CSA standard. And if you have something that requires redevelopment, then you'll generally fall into a Reg 153 kind of standard. If we can go to the next slide. So the question that's often raised by our clients is, why do we even need environmental site assessments? Next. So we have a couple of, we've posed ourselves a couple of questions and answers. So the first answer to that question is, quite frankly, you need bank financing. And we find it's pretty common now that you won't get financing without some kind of an environmental site assessment. That generally starts out with the requirement for a phase 1 site assessment, which identifies the current uses, the past uses, and the characteristics of your site. And if the site is clean, it also looks at the neighbors and the same thing, the current uses and the past uses of your neighbors within 250 meters. And that radius is prescribed under the regulation. So phase 1 environmental site assessment is the entry level point of the work that we do. And so we thought it would be appropriate to talk about what that involves. So what is a phase 1 site assessment? It starts off with a site walkover. Well, maybe not starts off, but one of the components is a site walkover and looking for visual evidence of what a site has been used for. So has it been automotive in nature? What kind of contaminating uses around potentially contaminating chemicals or other uses might be apparent on site? What is the housekeeping? What does the neighborhood look like? All of those kinds of things. So we'll do a physical survey of the site and take photo documentation of that. So the next component is we distribute a online owner survey that asks many of the same questions, like what are you using this for, and what is your history with the site? When was it developed? What do you do there? And so this gives us a background to ask further questions with respect to a specific owner interaction. So we need this again, having an owner survey as a component of the regulations. So we meet that through two ways. One is this online survey and then an interview to back that up. If we can go to the next one. We also look at historic information that's available within the public records. So those could be things like air photographs, like you see in the bottom right. They can be fire insurance maps, which detail what was undertaken on that particular property in a certain time period. And then it can be through occurrence reporting, like spills reporting or things like that, or environmental compliance approvals that are on your site or on adjacent sites. So we look at all those historical records for data with respect to the environmental condition on your site. Next slide. We often get asked the question, well, why is my site, why do you consider things potentially contaminating activities? And the reason why we consider it potentially contaminating activities is because somebody tells us to do that. So we don't make it up. We don't provide you with, just, hey, it's Tuesday, so we feel that this should be on the list or not. There is an actual list. This is the actual list. It comes out of OREG 153. And if your property use or your surrounding property uses fall within this list, then we are required under that regulation to investigate those as potentially contaminating activities and either eliminate them based on the evidence that we find during our owner surveys or our walkthrough or other historical research, or we're required to investigate those further. So even though you may have a good operation, if you're on the list, then unfortunately you're considered to be potentially contaminating, and that requires additional work. Next slide. So what happens at the end of a phase 1 report? You have a choice. Well, you don't have a choice, but we have a choice. If the evidence leads us to make an opinion that the site is quote unquote clean or doesn't have any environmental concerns, then the process can stop at the phase 1 environmental site assessment. And you can take that to your financing, or you can make that as part of your purchase. And that meets the requirements of disclosure on the site. The next step is that the phase 1 environmental assessment has a list of potentially contaminating activities or potential environmental concerns. Short form we use for that is APEX, that need further investigation. So those can be of greater or lesser concern. Sometimes we don't think it's high priority, and we'll tell you that. But in other instances, we think that it has more merit that needs additional work. So you'll see in the picture, if our subject site is the one in the bottom right-hand corner with an office building on it and a parking lot, the fact that they may have a clean bill of health on that property doesn't necessarily lead them to having a clean phase 1. Excuse me, because they have this issue of a gas station next door, so that leads to an APEC on their property. So that gives you an idea of how that process works. We can go to the next slide. So the second thing is, why might I need an environmental site assessment? Again, it's liability. So if the bank doesn't take liability without a phase 1, then why should you? Is a question you should ask yourself. And everyone has different risk profiles, so maybe that would be an appropriate, you would have an appropriate answer for that. But again, it does require professional expertise to avoid costly consequences. So just because a site looks good on the surface doesn't mean that it's good in the subsurface, and contamination doesn't know boundaries. So we would always suggest to our clients that they undertake that level of due diligence. Next slide. And then the third reason why you might need an environmental site assessment is because it's a requirement under OREG 153. And that means you're undertaking, or you're considering redeveloping your property for less sensitive use. So you're going from industrial commercial to residential or parkland use, which is, of course, more sensitive. So under those characteristics, then you will buy a condition of building permit. You won't get a building permit at the very least until you have this record of site condition in place. If we can go to the next slide. So then what is a record of site condition? Record of site condition is simply a public database that discloses that that property at a certain point in time has followed the protocol required by the Ministry of the Environment to obtain that piece of paper with respect to environmental conditions. So it's undertaken at the very least a phase 1 and maybe a phase 2. Maybe there's been some remediation, maybe there's been a risk assessment. But it is something that is controlled by the Ministry of the Environment and maintained. The database is maintained by them as well. Other municipalities can also request that you get an RSC for different conditions. Wherever possible, we would suggest that you challenge that requirement and see if there's a way to negotiate out of it, because it is an extra layer of cost and effort. Some would say bureaucracy, but there is an extra layer of cost and effort that's required to get that record of site condition. So we would always recommend that you probe that a bit more to get the framework that the municipality might have, because the municipality does have the right to request a record of site condition as part of the work that you're undertaking, if that's part of their requirements. They are also gatekeepers in this protocol. Next slide. So just to provide a bit more context with respect to a record of site condition, people ask for a record of site condition and they're hoping they can just get us to file a record of site condition. As we mentioned before, the bare minimum to get a record of site condition is to get a phase 1. So you must always do these two things in concert at the very least. And if the phase 1 develops areas of potential environmental concern, then you will have to get a phase 2. And then within that phase 2, if the phase 2 identifies not just potential environmental concerns, but actual environmental concerns, then you will have to undertake some kind of a remedial activity or mitigation of those concerns. So this is what the record of site condition process looks like. So it's not just simply filing paperwork, but there is some background studies that have to go into that effort. Next slide. Again, it's the same thing if the municipality requires it, if they're asking for a record of site condition, or an OREG 153 phase 1, the record of site condition will require the OREG 153-04. So you still have those two pairings, and the same thing happens if the OREG 153-04 phase 1 shows something, then you will need a phase 2, and you will need remedial activities. So this process is set by regulation, whether they're asking for a phase 1 or whether they're asking for a record of site condition. So you can see the difference that might happen when you're interacting with the municipality. Next slide.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. I was going to jump in at this point and describe some of the frequently asked questions we'll receive around environmental site assessments. Yeah, so I'll just get right into it. A common question we'll get is, I did a phase 1 5 years ago. Can I still use this report? Well, it can't be used for an RSC. The Ministry of the Environment stale dates reports at over 18 months old. So that's one reason that an old report will often not be sufficient for your purposes. You may not be able to get financing. Banks will assess their liability for a site, and depending on how old the report is, may not be acceptable for their lending, to support their lending decisions. We can incorporate useful information from previous reports into an updated report. However, This doesn't impact the price of a phase one that much. And why does the bank or the Ministry of the Environment need the report updated? Why is this a process that needs to be updated regularly? Well, things change over time. So activities on a site at a particular moment in time can change. And that goes back to the potentially contaminating activities list that Paul presented earlier. Should your site or any of the neighboring properties within 250 meters, should the activities on these sites be identified on this list, then it is likely that you'll require further investigation. So another question that we often receive is, I run a clean operation, so why do I need one? And simply put, it is in the regulation. So Ontario OREG Regulation 15304 identifies the potentially contaminating activities, like we mentioned, and should any of the on-site operations, despite doing a very good job of managing waste and running clean operations, if the activities exist on this list, then it's going to require a phase one at the very least. And that leads us to another question that we'll often receive is, I know a phase two is required, so why do I need a phase one? And you're right, for some sites, this will be inevitable. We can, once again, return to our PCA list to note that should those be activities on site, well, we can figure that a phase two is inevitable. So there's two main reasons why you can't conduct a phase two without the phase one. Chiefly being you can't file for an RSC, so record of site conditions, you won't be able to obtain one without a phase one, and that's in regulation. And your bank likely will not accept a limited phase two. Limited phase two being the investigation goes towards delineation based on without phase one information. So we have an example, turning back to the example that Paul brought up earlier, where we have an adjacent gas station to the west here. A limited phase two, through our investigations, we would identify the western boundary as an area of potential environmental concern. So we can see that through a limited phase two, we would definitely find catchment of this, and we would identify this. However, through a limited phase two investigation, we can miss key information. So in this case, a historic spill on the southeastern portion of the property wouldn't be identified to us through a limited phase two. We require the phase one process going through our historical record searches, like Paul mentioned, and we would uncover information that would allow us to identify another area of potential environmental concern in the area of APEC 2 listed in the slide. So ultimately, going through the regulatory process, phase one to phase two, allows you to be more confident in what exists on your site and what sort of environmental liabilities may be present on your site. And cost is a frequently asked question around phase two environmental site investigations. So phase two ESAs, they can cost anywhere between 18 to 20,000, and then tens of thousands of dollars depending on how complicated a site can be. And the level of complication for a site depends on various factors, chiefly how many areas of a potential environmental concern are identified, what are the types of contaminants we're looking at, and then some of the hydrogeological properties of the site, how deep is the groundwater, what are the soil characteristics, and these can play into cost. Also, where a site is located is chief among them. So when you look at cost, what goes into a phase two environmental site assessment? Well, we have cost of drillers, laboratory costs, which require accreditation. So we use CALA approved labs, and you need the work of a consultant. So an environmental engineering firm to advise you and guide you through the process and the goals for your site. And all of the constituents of this process can be costly, and you can see the slide there. So I'll move forward. Why does a phase two ESA cost so much? This can also be due to the iterative nature of a phase two environmental site investigation. So let's look at this example. This is a fairly basic example where in a phase two, we've gone in and we've done some testing and developed soil samples along 4 boreholes. And we note that borehole 2 has been identified with a contaminant that exceeds acceptable site criteria for that particular property. And this will require another level of, or another iteration of a phase 2 process. So we need to do more drilling to get a horizontal extent of the contamination. It's especially important to be aware of sort of the lateral extent of a contamination. And this can add to the cost of a phase 2, sort of this iterative process where we go in, we make our first assessment, and should we uncover contamination, then we require further work to delineate the contaminant and eventually get an idea of where the contaminant exists and what the plume shape may be. We want to get a 3D perspective. Obviously, lateral extent is important. However, through vertical delineation, we need to know how far down a contaminant may exist below ground surface. So in this case, we can see that the first borehole we drilled, borehole 2, we found an exceedance and a contaminant at 1 meter below ground surface, but then also at 6 meters below ground surface, which is at the bottom of our borehole in this case. So this particular example, we would be requiring to drill to a greater depth to establish the bottom of the contaminant, or at least until we can establish a clean boundary along a vertical horizon. So the delineation through a phase 2 can add to the cost depending on how the contaminant exists on your particular site. But yeah, I'll pass the mic back to you, Paul, and can bring some insights.
Thanks, Mark. So the background on phase 2 work then, of course, raises the question of how do we determine if a site is contaminated or not. And again, that goes back to the regulation. Reg 15304 provides us with 9 different tables, and those tables provide the criteria under certain conditions, and we have to identify the physical characteristics of those conditions and apply the appropriate table. So the numbers change if you're close to a lake or a wetland, or if you're in shallow bedrock, or if you have potable groundwater, or if you have you're in a city, then those numbers change. But in most cases, those numbers focus down on 2 particular things. If we go to the next slide. And then those slides, those 2 tables that drive most of our work are Table 2 and Table 3. And you can see the difference between Table 2 and Table 3 is that under Table 2, you're allowed, or the community is allowed to drink the groundwater, or they get their potable drinking water from the subsurface. And in Table 3, that's not the case. So in urban centers like Toronto or other places like that, where you draw the drinking water from the Lake Ontario in that case, then that would be a non-potable condition. But if you're in a more rural area, or if you're in a built-up area that draws their groundwater as a potable groundwater source, like Kitchener Water or Guelph or places like that, or any of the more rural areas, then you'll be in a potable situation. So those 2 tables drive most of our work and are dependent on whether the site is potable or non-potable with respect to groundwater. We can go to the next slide. So that gives us generic conditions. So then we also have the idea, once we've looked at the generic site conditions on the left side of the table, is we can say, my site is not generic, or your site is not generic in this case. And under those conditions, we can apply a process called site-specific risk assessment. And under that process, we can look at the individual site characteristics where they differ from those assumed in generic site conditions. And those can be quite extensive, like, is the site paved? Does it have a lot of vegetation or not? what kind of use is there on the ground level? Does it have a basement? There's all sorts of things that, excuse me, can fall into the category of a risk assessment. But essentially what comes out of a risk assessment is a set of tailored criteria that are applicable for a site on a unique basis, and that can go into the process as well. This can be a very powerful tool to bring your site into compliance for a record of site condition and for redevelopment, and even for managing risk for continued on-site use. While it is more flexible, it is that flexibility comes with some complications in terms of site investigation, but it does give you more options with respect to use, and it does give you the ability to manipulate those. Of course, that takes longer and generally, well, always costs more. But if you meet the generic criteria, if you don't meet the generic criteria, then it is a valuable tool there. If we can go to the next slide. So what are my choices if I don't meet the standards? One of them is to remediate. In other words, get rid of the contamination that doesn't comply. And it doesn't matter if the compliance is related to, it doesn't matter if the compliance is, or the non-compliance is related to your generic site criteria, your risk-based criteria. In both of those cases, the only option, if you have soil that or groundwater that doesn't comply to either of those criteria, is then to remediate it. So remediation falls into categories, and we won't go into a lot of depth on those, but those categories are physical treatment, and that's kind of indicated by the backhoe here. Everybody understands that if you dig up contaminated soil and you send it to landfill, then you've removed it from your site, and your site can be compliant. In many instances, either because of the nature of the contamination, in other words, it's not amenable to digging it up, or from a cost perspective, or from a, maybe there's a big building next door. So from a foundation stability point of view, it's not, it can't be supported. Then in those instances, you have to go to alternate procedures with respect to remediation, and those procedures generally fall into some kind of physical or chemical treatment. Whether that is bioremediation, where you dig it up and build biopiles, or you treat it in situ with biologically, or you use it, you treat it in situ chemically, either in a reductive or a non-oxygen environment, or an oxygenated environment, or you physically treat it with chemicals that destroy or address organic contamination. So those would be things like reactive agents that oxidize or reduce, or it falls into the category of physically binding a contaminant to make it more inert or less mobile, which you might do for something like chrome 6 to turn it into chrome 3. So the total chrome number might stay the same, but the toxicity of the contaminant would change. So hopefully you get a flavor for those that there's a number of different choices with respect to remediation, and we hope to hold webinars in the near future that deal with maybe delving into those things in a little bit more detail. So look out for those as well, and we'll flesh those out a bit more for you. If we can go to the next slide. So after all of this, hopefully you're not sitting there scared, saying I should never buy contaminated property, or be willing to engage on these kind of property transfers. Our answer is yes, absolutely. At least be willing to take a look at it. Everyone has a different risk profile, or every transaction may even have a different risk profile. So understanding the liability is important, and we always try and flesh out that liability. The other thing is do you need a bank to finance your purchase? And then is that in the near term or is it in the long term? Because we often operate within the realm what's called a project management triad, which is time, quality, and cost fit together. So if you can play with those things and you have more time, maybe you can clean it up to the point where it's appropriate to finance it, and you can self-finance in the short term. But that kind of leads into the next thing, which is what are you planning to do with the property? If you're continuing the existing use, have contamination on your property, it becomes something where you want to be protective of the users of that property, be they your own employees or people that might come on there, of course. And we can show how you can do that and do that in a way that's defensible. And then the last thing, of course, is what's your exit strategy? So it could be that that you want to buy a contaminated property, clean it up over time, and then realize the improved value of that asset, or just participate in the property market and even sell the as an impacted property in the future. But your exit strategy should be clearly defined, and we certainly wouldn't recommend that you walk away from a property just because it has some impacts or continue to own it. We can go to the next slide.
Yes, so I'm going to speak to some of the challenges and pitfalls associated with the phase 1 and phase 2 ESAs. So it's important for people who are investigating which consultants to use to understand or get an idea of what sort of information they should be provided and what are the right questions to ask. So some of the common pitfalls that we've seen is in certain reports, PCAs are not identified, with the associated contaminants of concerns unknown. We've spoken to the stale dating of RSC reports. So in the case of an outdated report that's likely not usable for your purposes in obtaining financing or record of site condition. And once again, this is really in the due diligence of the consultants that you'll use, but it is important that the reporting is done correct, especially in OREG 15304. It's especially stringent, so it's important to know what the standards are and have the reporting done appropriately. And we spoke to the importance of delineation on a phase 2. So having a lateral and vertical delineation is especially important to draw conclusions on the environmental status of a site. You have to have sufficient groundwater and soil sampling that's compliant with standards through the regulation. And for instance, in terms of phase 2, for it to be OREG 153 compliant, it needs to have, an investigation has to have more than three or more wells. So if you have fewer than 3 monitoring wells, a record of site condition, it will not be an option because your phase 2 will not be in compliant. And then also, like Paul mentioned, just knowing what table to compare your site data to. So these are the types of things that consultants can provide insights on and guide you through the process. Yes, and I'm going to pass it back to you, Paul, based on your breadth of experience and what makes some of these projects especially challenging.
So lots of times we get asked questions in the middle of a project, things like, why do we keep testing? Is it ever going to stop? The answer to that question is yes, it will stop. It may not stop as soon as you would like it to stop, and you may not be able to see that, but a number of things come into that. And we try and, at each step of the way, explain why additional work might be required, and it's part of the iterative process in terms of doing a phase 2 particularly, or a phase 2 tied to remediation or risk assessment. But the intent is that we meet the regulations, so we stop when the regulation conditions are met. And ultimately, if you're filing for a record of site condition, the Minister of the Environment is the independent arbitrator of whether those conditions have been met. So wherever possible, we try and look at the minimum requirements to file a record of site condition, or close to the minimum requirements to file a record of site condition, with the intent that we don't want to spend your money if the MOE thinks it's going to, or we think the MOE is going to accept those conditions. So we will at each step of the way talk to you about that and see what that looks like. Again, in a similar vein, is the scope of work correct, and how do we know? Because it's in the regulation is the short answer, but we can always give you specific details. They usually have to do with things like delineation either vertically or horizontally, and what does that look like? The next question would be, how do you know that you have the right team? So we choose to focus on this business, and in our experience, you need a multi-talented team that includes the ability to do environmental site assessments according to the regulations, to be able to conduct remediation, to be able to interact with the Minister of the Environment, and to have risk assessment capabilities. And all of those conditions may come up within the context of your project. So understanding what the depth of the team is important. Then the other thing that can make a project challenging is stakeholder expectations. So on projects, specifically with respect to schedule and budget, if we know that you have a significantly contaminated site, and you want to go to a more sensitive use, so you're going from industrial or commercial to residential, let's say, for residential redevelopment, then we will try and manage those expectations with respect to schedule and budget. We'll try and give you a global budget, not that it's cast in stone, but we try and give you a global budget for the entire project and a schedule that could be like a couple of years long. So you have to understand that sometimes these things take time and can be very expensive. We also look at current use versus future use. We look at things like operational risk versus long-term exit strategies. And we also look at things like, what's your due diligence level effort? So all of those things can make a project challenging. You can go to the next slide. Then a site can be challenging, right? We haven't got clear definition of contamination. Is it in the groundwater? Is it in the soil? What kind of contaminant is it? Is it chlorinated solvents, which are more difficult to deal with versus things like petroleum hydrocarbons, gasoline, or diesel? Is it difficult or slow to remediate? What kind of degradation products, and are they hazardous? Will they affect indoor air quality, and are there ongoing site operational needs in terms of access or in terms of addressing contamination? Next slide. So then again, just to recap with respect to redevelopment properties and issues that we have, things like, is the right standard used? Is the standard not met? Did we use CSA when we should have used Reg 153? Did we not identify a potentially contaminating activity, or we identified a potentially contaminating activity that wasn't on the list? So in terms of the outcome, are we going to have a limited phase 2, or are we going to have a complete phase 2? And did we identify actual PCAs offsite as opposed to not being able to identify them in a phase 1? So all of those things can fall into the categories of looking at a specific project. Next slide. So just to wrap it up in terms of final thoughts, don't be afraid to be informed, ask lots of questions. All of your risks can be managed, but you have to identify your risk tolerance within that, and hopefully we will be able to lead you through that process so you can make a good decision. We always like to think you need to choose your consultant carefully and understand about your goal alignment in that conversation. Resist the temptation to walk away from your problems or problematic sites. There may be hidden value that comes in there because if you're tempted to walk away, then somebody else may be tempted to walk away even more. And so there may be an opportunity there to look at it. And then look at creative problem solving within that that creates value, of course. But always try and base it on realistic solutions that are proven and can get you to that end line with reliability. And that's the end, and we're also on time. So I think this is a time for some questions.
Yeah, so feel free to add any extra questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A, whatever you find first. We're monitoring both. We have a couple questions from Patrick that I'll do my best to interpret. If we're missing something, Patrick, please let us know. So the first question is, would we need a new or amended ESA if we've done remediation that's been ongoing for several years?
I'll take that one. The ESA is a progressive document. So if you're doing remediation that's going on for a number of years, the only two ESA documents that the Ministry of the Environment recognizes are a phase 1 and a phase 2. So any kind of remedial work at the end of the day will result in an updated phase 2. So all of that information with respect to the remediation should get rolled into a phase 2, not a phase 3, but a phase 2, not a remediation report, but a phase 2 where all of that information is appended into the phase 2 document train. So we rarely find in those conditions that the phase 2 is out of date, but what may be out of date is your phase 1 because it lasts several years. The MOE doesn't accept phase 1s that are more than 18 months. So we usually recommend a refresh of the phase 1 when you get close to submitting your record of site condition documentation, and that then brings the phase 1 into compliance.
Okay. The next question is, ESA boundaries are 250 meters. I think I can actually speak to that one. So yes, when we're looking at a phase 1. We're looking at your site and we're looking at properties that are within 250 meters of your site. And the reason for that is because that's what's defined in the Ontario regulations. So that's a pretty straightforward answer. But the reason that it's in there is because contamination doesn't know property boundaries. So we consider 250 meters is the amount of distance that is reasonable to consider that might be able to reach your site in terms of contamination. So certainly it can potentially be written off for different reasons. So if we determine that the groundwater isn't flowing in a certain direction, then perhaps it's not important to investigate in a phase 2, but that's why it's included in the 250 meters.
And the other thing is sometimes what we try and do in most assessments is to calculate that 250 meters from the center of the site. But often, if you have a very large site, you'll have 250 meters that extends from the property boundary. So it can even be a larger area than it may be otherwise.
Excellent. So our next question is in regards to one of the examples we gave where we showed that borehole 2 was contaminated. So the question is, borehole 2 has contamination. Does that extend the boundaries of the ESA scope?
The short answer is yes. The phase 2, it depends on where you're going with that. If borehole 2 is contaminated, you have the choice of either accepting the extent of contamination to the next clean borehole, which may be quite distant from the one that you just found, and hence have a higher than a non-realistic estimate of remedial work that's required or risk that needs to be managed. The second thing is if you're going for a record of site condition, one of the things that the MOE screens when they're reviewing that documentation is the distance between boreholes, particularly between contaminated and clean boreholes. And they like to set those at somewhere between 5 and maybe even 5 meters, as low as 5 meters. But we use the rule of thumb of maybe between 5 and 10 meters. It is quite restrictive with respect to the distance between those boreholes, and that often is a point of contention that we will try and push a bit in our submission of the record of site condition documentation. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not, but that's what we'll look at.
Okay, our next question is from Ralph. Is there a specific accreditation in order to do a phase one?
Yeah, if you are submitting something for a record of site condition, then the answer is unequivocally yes. You must be a qualified person under OREG 15304, and a qualified person under OREG 15304 is generally defined as a professional geologist registered with the PGO or a professional engineer registered with the Association of Professional Engineers. So if you're submitting for a record of site condition, then the answer is yes. There is with respect to doing phase ones, you can get phase one information that is prepared by someone with a different accreditation than that. And you'll have to undertake whether that is appropriate for your uses or not. In some cases, it may be perfectly appropriate. In other instances, it may not be. We are finding more and more, especially on the municipal level, if you're submitting a document for the municipality, they're asking for that at least in that's generally compliant with Reg 15304, and also for bank financing. We often see bank financing requests. They have a standardized level. So maybe if you're looking at financing, check and see if your bank has accredited consultants on their financing list. That's one way to look at qualifications outside of the PGO or PEng or qualified person stamp. But generally speaking, if it's Reg 15304, it's PEng or PGO.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Stephen. What do I determine conclusively is an activity on a phase one property within the PCA list? So I guess what I'm thinking the question is basically, how do I determine if there's something on the site that will trigger a phase two, is what I'm interpreting.
Right. So what we do is read the list, and if that activity appears on your property currently or historically, then we have to investigate that further. Does it automatically trigger a phase two? Not necessarily. So it like Adrianne mentioned briefly there a minute ago, if the potentially contaminating activity is a transgradient or downgradient with respect to the groundwater direction, and we don't think that the potential is there for that contamination to come onto your property, we may be able to eliminate it based on that. Maybe it's something that is relatively immobile, like certain contaminants don't move very easily, or they're not readily dissolved in groundwater. And if those are offsite and at some distance from the property, then maybe they don't need to be investigated further. But if it's on the list, it needs explanation or it needs further work.
And I guess the answer to your question is the way you determine that is by doing the phase one. That's what we're doing through the phase one. We're gathering a lot of information, and we're using that to put together the list of if you actually should act on that potential concern.
Right. So maybe that needs to be clarified a bit. A potentially contaminating activity is the outcome of your phase one. Just to reiterate that. So your phase one should have a list that says, here's the potentially contaminating activities on your property, and we've screened those activities through the regulation and the list that's prepared by the Minister of the Environment. So that is the point of a phase one, is a list of potentially contaminating activities. If it doesn't have that list and it doesn't back it up with a review of those contaminating activities based on the ministry's requirements, then I would consider that to be a non-compliant phase one.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. Is there a way to access an environmental report from my neighbor's property?
The easiest way is go and ask them, I guess. That's probably the only way you'll get it. So where you can say, is it worth going and asking them, is if you see evidence of an environmental investigation. So if you see some sampling wells like we put in for phase two, or you've seen drill rigs on site, or you've seen remedial activities or something like that, then for sure that may be worth investigating more, and something that we would look at in the conduct of a phase one. There is some public information. Obviously, we protect our sources. We protect our client work from outside investigation as much as possible. But there is some public records that we include in the phase ones, things like record of site conditions on adjacent properties, which has a lot of information, things like Minister of the Environment Freedom of Information requests, which may include some environmental reports, things like surveys for spill records or water wells or things like that we get out of the public records. So there is a lot of information there. Does it include everything? No, not necessarily. There may be more information than we can get through the public record. So,
okay, we actually just. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I thought I saw another question.
Yeah, one more just
as well that we can probably fit in.
If there's evidence of a past buried oil tank on site or concealed in a building, is a phase one required, or is there an alternate clearance?
Well, certainly the phase one is the method by which you would identify that tank, right? So the phase one would identify that there's an underground storage tank, either currently or historically, and then it's a question of a review of the risk that's associated with that and the amount of information that's to support that. So you may be able to clear that by saying, look, this is a fuel tank, it's under the building. We've done some phase two sampling at the perimeter of the building and there's no contamination there. So while there might be contamination in the immediate vicinity of that tank, it doesn't seem to be widespread. And so, don't worry about it. That may be a possibility. There may be a historic report where that tank has been removed, and they have some sampling data that goes along with that and some groundwater data, and it can be cleared based on that. Or it may be something that is, for other reasons, fairly straightforward. So it is possible to categorize the risk, but in terms of identifying a risk, an underground storage tank is definitely a risk, and it will appear in the phase one, and you'll need to address that and then say, I can accommodate that risk or not. We do find that underground storage tanks and petroleum hydrocarbon tanks in particular are not as big of an issue with a number of financing institutions that they used to be. So I wouldn't run scared just based on that. But it is something that has to be addressed in the context of a record of site condition for sure, and would need to be eliminated based on physical evidence. So I don't know if that answered the question, but clearance-wise, there are things like the Fuel Safeties Branch has some processes that you go through. Those are useful. But in terms of an RSC, there is a specific process that has to be followed. So.
Super. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up. I think that answers everybody's questions, but if you have any questions in the future, please feel free to email us or give us a call. We're always happy to talk to you. Thanks everybody for attending our session. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be with us. If you wouldn't mind, please filling out the survey that'll pop up. It would really help us for future webinars. But thanks so much and have a great day.